Hello, this is Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to be talking about the world in 1491. And we're going to start by looking at what's going on in Europe in the year 1491. Now, why are we starting with 1491 and Europe? I thought this was a US history class. I thought that, we weren't going to talk about the history of the United States and the colonization until contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Well, if we're going to understand the impact of that contact, we actually have to rewind and understand where the different parts of the world were, what was happening in different areas of the world before the point of contact in 1492. So today we're going to focus on what's going on in Europe because Europe is going to be the continent that takes the lead in conquering and colonizing the Americas. So what's been going on in Europe leading up to the year 1492? That's the big question. And Europe, this will sound very similar to those of us at the time of this recording in 2020, Europe is recovering in 1491 still from a pandemic. In this case, the pandemic was of a disease called the bubonic plague. So a bubo was like a swollen lymph node, and the bubonic plague struck with deadly accuracy across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The disease was transmitted to humans by fleas who came in contact with infected animals, usually rats, and this was spread from originally southwest China throughout Asia, Europe, and Africa by trade, which was increasingly growing between those areas. So the bubonic plague, which gained the nickname Black Death because the swollen lymph nodes would turn black, became a huge, huge cause of loss of human life. Throughout the 1330s and the 1340s, the bubonic plague struck down an estimated 75 million people worldwide. When the bubonic plague arrived in Europe in 1347, the death toll was catastrophic. Somewhere between 20 to 30 million people in Europe, or on estimate, about 25 to 33% of the population died. And if you got the bubonic plague, your chance of dying was between 60 to 70%. So imagine living in a time of this Black Death pandemic, 1 in 4 people are dying due to this disease, or in some places 1 in 3. So this is a horrific population loss in a very short period of time. Tens of millions of people die. And this is going to cause some lingering impacts in Europe when it comes to European culture. We're going to have this religious and cultural reckoning with so much death surrounding people. Some people turn and cling closer to religion, which is going to have important connotations for us as we continue pushing closer to 1491 in European history. Some people reject religion altogether and ask why a merciful God would visit such death upon the world. Some people looked at this as a way to kind of grapple with their mortality. Peasants, because of the lower population, suddenly had strength in negotiation in terms of the price and value of their labor. So this also led to peasant revolts due to labor shortages and more valuable work conditions. And it's going to take a while for European population to bounce back from this catastrophic loss due to the Black Death. Now, in the wake of the Black Death, with all of this social upheaval and chaos caused by this loss of life, we also have the emergence of modern states in Europe. In particular, we have the growth of regional nations who make it a point to strengthen and centralize their power. So, for example, we're going to see the emergence of regional states like France, England, Spain, and Russia come out of the 1300s and the 1400s. One thing that all of these nations had in common was they moved to consolidate power in the hands of a ruler, usually a king, sometimes a queen, by trying to disempower the nobility who posed the biggest threat to the challenge, or excuse me, to the authority of the king or queen. To do that, these nations started taxing. Yes, the origin of the modern system of taxation, at least as it looks today, because taxes are very old, but the modern system of taxation dates back to this time period in the 1300s and the 1400s. This was pioneered by small city states in Italy using things like sale taxes or taxes on trade goods to bankroll the growth of government, both in terms of bureaucracy, people managing the government, but also to bankroll large standing armies, which these nations not only needed to consolidate power against the nobility who didn't have the option to tax or raise large standing armies to counter the rulers of these European nations, but also to fight against each other. Most notably, France and England fought what's called the Hundred Years' War, which lasted actually over 100 years between 1337 and 1453, which bankrupted both nations and seriously weakened them before they were able to sort of reestablish control and authority at home. So competitions between nations like this Hundred Years' War between France and England became common as these nations are fighting over turf. We also see an arms race, a rush to adopt the newest and best technology when it came to weapons, many of which was introduced through contact with Asia. For example, gunpowder first reached Europe by the mid 1200s, due largely to contact with the invading Mongols. Armies were using cannons, although very sort of primitive ones with little aim. And as we get closer to 1491, we're also going to see very, very early versions of guns, in particular muskets. And so these nations are racing to compete for territory. And for some nations, it's very difficult to expand territory because of geographic barriers like the ocean or mountains, or strong opposition from their fellow regional nation states. So there's a lot of desire of competition here that's going to explain a lot when it comes to how Europeans colonized the Americas. Another trend that we see in Europe leading up to 1491 is clashes with Islamic states. So we still have a number of Islamic states in the areas around the Mediterranean. In the 1400s, we still actually have a Muslim kingdom in the south of Spain, Grenada. And we also have a very large Muslim empire located in what is today Turkey called the Ottoman Empire. And the largely Christian, at the time Catholic Christian, Europe had clashed repeatedly with these Islamic states in what is today the Middle East during the Crusades, this period between 1095 and 1492 CE, in which Europeans attempted to win back control of holy sites like Jerusalem in the Middle East away from Islamic control. These crusades, for the most part, don't really end up being very successful, so I'm not going to go into them too much here. But these crusades are not only taking place in places like the Middle East, but also closer to home. The modern nation state of Spain is created by the marriage alliance of King Ferdinand and Isabella, who unite the two regional kingdoms of Castile and Aragon to become Spain. And Spain's big interest is in getting rid of the remnant of Islamic kingdoms in Spain, the last remaining Islamic kingdom in Spain at the southern tip of Grenada. And this process of pushing Muslims out of Spain and Portugal becomes known as the Reconquista, or the reconquering, pushing Muslims out, not only gaining control for the Spanish political state, but also reasserting Christian authority. The Ottoman Empire also has interest in expansion, and they're going to clash after the year 1500 with European states like the Habsburg Empire. And your textbook is going to talk a little bit more about that because that will be, again, kind of important to understand European politics to kind of explain how European nations compete against each other in the Americas. Lastly, the last big major trend you need to know about Europe is that Europeans, as I mentioned, are hungry for more territory, but they're also hungry for stuff, in particular trade goods with Asia. Europeans love trade goods with Asia. Asia is the place to get luxury commodities at this time. If you wanted silk, guess what? China had pretty much a lock on production of silk. So you got to go to China. If you wanted spices, most exotic spices came from areas like Southeast Asia or India. So, if you're thinking, what is an exotic spice? Even something we would consider common today, like pepper, was a hot commodity because these crops simply did not grow in Europe. If you wanted stuff like sugar, again, you kind of had to trade with Asia because, again, European climate is not conducive to growing sugar cane. So if you wanted any kind of luxury products from silk to porcelain to spices, you got to trade with Asia. And for Europeans, the long journey over land from Asia meant that these trade goods were very expensive. And so a lot of Europeans started looking for ways to cut the costs on these luxury products that were in high demand. And so they started wondering whether it was possible to get to Asia from Europe by ocean. And Portugal actually leads the way on these voyages of exploration. The Portuguese become the first with Vasco da Gama to circumnavigate Africa, to sail around the southern tip of Africa, up the coast, and get to India. And even though it took da Gama 2 years to do his round trip voyage between Lisbon and Calcutta, he more than made up for it because of the value of the cargo of pepper he brought back from India. So Portugal takes the way in navigating and finding ocean-going trade routes to Asia, and that really upsets Spain and other European powers. And so there's all of a sudden this race and exploration to find better routes to Asia. There's also this desire not only for trade, but also for land. And so when Portugal and their sister nation to their east, Spain, start to engage in exploration for the purpose of traveling to Asia, they discover islands off of the coast of Africa, like the Canary Island chain. And they give these islands the nickname the Fortunate Isles because their climate is fairly tropical. It's gorgeous. I mean, don't take my word for it. Google images of the Canary Islands. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's still a vacation destination today. And so we start seeing the Portuguese and the Spanish take over these islands and conquer them from the native people, the Guanches. And they see the profit potential in the Canaries not only as their sort of position as a stopping point for Europeans voyaging from Europe to Asia, but also because of their tropical climate, the ability to grow sugarcane, which is an important cash crop. So, what we're actually going to see in the Canaries and the other island chains in that region off the coast of Africa, collectively nicknamed the ironic Fortunate Isles because of what happens to the natives, they pretty much die off or are assimilated and enslaved. The Europeans start this process of colonization that's going to look a lot like what they do in the Americas, particularly with this system of attempting to convert natives to Catholic Christianity, of enslaving natives using forced labor to produce cash crops. We're going to see that happen in the Spanish and Portuguese colonization in the Americas as well. So really these island chains like the Canaries off the coast of Africa become a laboratory for how Europeans are going to colonize the Americas and other territories they encounter later. So that's the setup of Europe in 1491. We've got a lot of political states that are hungry to prove themselves, hungry to gain more power, more access to luxury trade routes, and more land. And now Europeans increasingly have the tools and the technology to do it. And all it's going to take for Europeans to get to the Americas is one, guy named Christopher Columbus, who is very bold but very bad at math, who believes that he can have a shortcut to Asia by just sailing west. So, we're going to talk more about Christopher Columbus next week, but for right now, I'm going to stop there, and that is the summary of where Europe is in 1491.